Hello everybody, and welcome back to another video. In today's video, we'll be taking a look at the 2024 presidential election, and specifically today I'll be focusing on a factor that has, in my opinion, been quite under-discussed, especially over the course of the past few months. Again, uh, the Republican and Democratic primaries felt like so long ago, and after all, the Democrats now running a candidate who is different from the one that won their primary, and we are doing, so many crazy things have happened in the past 2 months that we've kind of forgotten about it. But today I'll be shedding light on the Nikki Haley voters from the 2024 GOP primary. And again, there were a lot of them, maybe a lot more than you remember, especially in the 7 battleground states. So in just a second, we're beginning into that. But before I do that, I want to give a huge shout out and thanks to a gentleman named Tremaine Blair, who sent this data my way via Twitter/X. We had a brief conversation about what I'm about to discuss with you all today, and he sent me a graph with some of the data that I'll be using today. Again, it's all publicly accessible. The website that we used was Haley Voters for Harris, so feel free to look that up, and you can find the data that I'm referencing there. But again, huge shout out to Tremaine, and if anyone would like to see me do a video, please comment down below. That's the easiest way, or reach out to me, and I will likely do it if you give me like a compelling reason. So again, thank you all, or really thanks to Tremaine, and thank you all for continued support of the channel. And again, in the future, if you want to comment down a video, I will do it. But let's get into it today. We're going to be talking about Nikki Haley. We're going to be talking about her voters. And so just for some background, generally speaking, what's interesting about primaries isn't necessarily turnout or enthusiasm. It's where does the winning candidate perform the worst? And if you look back at the 2016 and 2020 Democratic primaries, both of which were very competitive, if you look at 2016, Hillary Clinton's worst performance with white working class voters. Bernie Sanders won those voters in that primary decisively. In November, which voting bloc came to doom her, especially in the Rust Belt? White working class voters. In 2020, where did Joe Biden struggle in the primary? You look at South Texas, you look at Nevada, it was with Hispanic voters who overwhelmingly backed Bernie Sanders in that primary, even though in 2016 they were not very good for Bernie Sanders. They switched to Sanders in 2020. In November, where did Biden struggle the most? It was with Hispanic voters in South Texas, in South Florida, especially in rural areas across the country. So primaries in the past couple of election cycles have actually been interesting in that they can kind of shed some light on where candidates are struggling. And Nikki Haley ran in a primary against Donald Trump that she really was at no point really close to winning. Donald Trump, from the get-go, was the favorite to win that primary, and by the time that we got to January with the Iowa caucuses, we knew he was going to be the GOP nominee. He was polling so far ahead of Haley, DeSantis, Christie, Ramaswamy, you name it. And so Nikki Haley was the Republican who I think ran the best campaign against Trump, which is why she stayed in the race longer than anyone else. And she actually did it. She actually did win a state, Vermont, narrowly. So obviously she was able to get some success, but she was never really close to winning that primary. But what we did see was that a lot of Republicans who didn't like Trump, or a lot of moderate voters who voted in that primary, used Haley as a vehicle to express their dislike of Trump, or to express their desire for someone else to be the nominee. And so Donald Trump obviously won the primary in all 7 of these big swing states that I've got on your map right now. But in some of these states, you'll be surprised to see how many votes Nikki Haley got and what that could mean for this upcoming election. Because really, Nikki Haley voters, the way they vote could decide the election. And that's not hyperbole. If you look at the margins in the key states that we are dealing with in this election, with in 6 of the big 7 states, one exception being Nevada, the number of Nikki Haley voters exceeds the vote margin that Joe Biden won or lost the state by. Obviously, Biden won 6 of the 7 states in 2020. He lost North Carolina, but the number of Haley voters in North Carolina more than exceeds the amount of votes Joe Biden lost North Carolina by in 2020. And then in Arizona, Nevada, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, in Arizona, Georgia, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, we saw that the number of Nikki Haley voters exceeded the number of votes that Biden won the state by last time. So these voters, they're not, this isn't like it's not like one of those things where you have an incumbent president running and maybe 2,000 people vote against him. In some of these states, it was well over 100,000. And in 6 of these 7 states, that margin was bigger than the margin that the state voted by in 2020. So very important data we're looking at here. And this could determine, like I said, who's going to win the election, because these are voters that in theory could be in play for Kamala Harris. Now, most of them are Republican voters, But Donald Trump historically, especially in 2020, did struggle with Republican voters to an extent. We saw, especially in states like Arizona and Georgia, Republican voters who've been voting for the GOP for decades, maybe voted for Trump even in 2016, switched over to Biden. And that was especially prevalent in the suburbs among educated voters, affluent voters, particularly white voters in these areas. And so Nikki Haley, if you look at her best performances, they came in Democratic-leaning suburbs across these swing states. And so it makes sense that if we use the primary, like I said with the examples of Democrats in 2016 and 2020, Donald Trump's weakest demographic was with those educated voters in blue-leaning suburbs in areas of these swing states. He did find the rural areas. He did mostly find the working-class areas. But you look at these suburbs, you look at these counties, it was concerning for him. So let's go to Arizona. This is our first case study here. Maricopa County. As I say whenever I talk about Arizona, this is where the money is. 61% of the 2020 vote share, or of the total votes cast in 2020 in Arizona, came from this county. It's where Phoenix is. It's where the surrounding suburbs are. It's moderate. It voted for Republicans for the entirety of the 2000s and 2010s, switched to Joe Biden in 2020. So, Nikki Haley, 73,000 votes here. And this is a county that Biden won by 45,000 in 2020. And 73,000, this was after Nikki Haley dropped out of the race. 73,000 people in this county came out and voted against Donald Trump. That's a concern for him. Pima County, this is where Tucson is. It's pretty Democratic leaning, not really a swing county like Maricopa. Haley still got 15,000 votes there. She got another 5,000 in Pinal County, which is the biggest GOP county in the state. So just across those three counties, Haley got over 93,000 votes. And statewide in Arizona, she got 111,000, which is 11 times the margin Joe Biden won the state by. So if these voters break for Kamala Harris even by a little bit in November, Donald Trump can't win Arizona, that's for sure. If you look at just the sheer volume of these voters, that is absolutely huge for Kamala Harris if she can win over these voters. Now, obviously, that's a question because Nikki Haley is a Republican. She's a conservative. She doesn't necessarily align with Kamala Harris, and she has endorsed Donald Trump. Now, I think that's going to help Trump. But again, a lot of these voters who voted for Nikki Haley might not come home for Trump because, again, Donald Trump, like I said, has historically struggled with that GOP vote in these suburbs. And so if history is any indicator and he continues to lose ground like he did in 2016, like he did again in 2020, we could see kind of a third wave of an exodus away from the Republican Party among suburban voters. In 2016, that came with more socially liberal suburban voters who had voted for Mitt Romney 4 years prior, but then really couldn't stomach Trump and have been voting Democratic ever since. In 2020, we saw kind of more moderate, centrist, Republican-aligned suburban voters who maybe, will still vote Republican down ballot, but now won't vote for Trump. And now the third wave could potentially be, conservative suburban voters who really don't like Trump, but are still going to vote Republican down ballot. But in this election, maybe voted for Nikki Haley because they want a Republican in the White House, but they don't want it to be Trump. That could be what we're seeing. And in Arizona, which is a state that is historically liked to vote for moderate Republicans, that could be a very fertile ground for that. Now, Nevada is a bit interesting because this is the one state where the Haley votes did not exceed the 2020 margin. But again, in Clark County, again, this is where over 70% of the 2020 electorate came from. 12,000 Haley votes. Not like a huge amount, but again, Nevada can be very close. And in 2022, the Senate race was decided by like 8,000 votes. So in a very close Nevada race, I think Haley voters could tip the balance in favor of either Trump or Harris. But to me, Nevada is probably her weakest state. Now, Georgia, this is an interesting one. I've got some counties in the Atlanta metro area on your screen here. Chatham is where Savannah is. I just wanted to put that there. But as you can see, if you read the geography, I've laid it out for you. These top two counties, these are downtown Atlanta. Nikki Haley got a combined 15,000 votes in these counties. And again, it won't be enough to really have an impact on how the counties vote, but 15,000 votes statewide, just in these two counties alone, that's bigger than the 12,000 votes Biden won the state by in 2020. And then you go to the suburbs where Haley percentage-wise did pretty well, especially in Cobb County. She got over 9,000 votes in a county that Biden won by 56K. So her, this isn't too shabby. If Biden, or if Harris can add another even 4,000 or 5,000 of these Haley voters in this county, that would be a huge boost for her. And then Cherokee and Forsyth, these are Republican-leaning counties. In North Atlanta, they're very exurban, but they are trending towards Democrats. Joe Biden did very well in these counties in 2020. Nikki Haley, as you can see here, she got nearly 7,000 votes in these counties combined. So that's interesting to watch. Now, North Carolina, this is an interesting one because Biden did lose the state in 2020. There's been some hype for Kamala Harris here, especially she's been gaining in the polls. But if we take a look at Nikki Haley's margins in these counties, look at Mecklenburg County. That's where Charlotte is. Historically, this county's been competitive, but in the past decade, it's really moved blue. Nikki Haley got 30,000 votes here almost. And again, 30,000 votes can't tip the balance of power in the county as a whole. 30,000 votes statewide is like half of what Trump won it by in 2020. So if you give these voters, if they swing towards Harris, that could be a sizable dent in the Trump margin from 2020. Then you've got another 36K in Wake County, which is where Raleigh is. Wake County, even 10 years ago, was actually a swing county. Democrats won it by a very good margin in 2020. Biden won it by 167K. Nikki Haley got another 36,000 votes here. So you combine these two numbers, this alone is enough to bring North Carolina to like a 10,000 vote margin for Trump. Then the rest of it can come out of these counties, right? Cabarrus, Guilford, Durham. Guilford and Durham are more Democratic-leaning counties, but Cabarrus is a GOP county that is north of Charlotte. So in North Carolina, it's interesting because Nikki Haley did very well statewide here. She got 250,000 votes in a state that, the Republican Party has won in the past, I think, in the past 3 presidential elections. So, I think North Carolina flipping would be a sign of kind of the dam breaking for Trump. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but really, this is, I think, one of the more concerning states on this list if you're Donald Trump, because this margin here, it isn't like, maybe Wisconsin where the margin is maybe 2.5 or almost 3 times as big. This one is 251,000 votes in a state that was less than 75K in 2020. That's a pretty significant amount. That's like, again, not to kind of be like too simple here, but that's an 175,000 vote gap in a state that we all agree is going to be very close. So that does matter. Now, I'm going to briefly go through the Rust Belt here. Nikki Haley didn't do as well in these states, but she still did quite well, considering the fact that she had suspended her campaign when these primaries were all held. Look at Waukesha and Ozaukee. These are 2 Republican counties outside of Milwaukee. These are the exurbs, the WOW counties. Nikki Haley, as you can see right here, she got nearly 12,000 votes across these 2 counties, and that would be sufficient to give Harris a pretty significant boost statewide. Again, in 2020, Donald Trump lost the state, or I think he won the state by around 25 or 30,000 votes. So you can, cut a pretty significant dent in his 2016 margin by just giving these voters to Harris. 2020, Biden won the state by 20K, so very close once again. Michigan, what's interesting here is that in Oakland County, which is a Democratic-leaning county in the suburbs north of Detroit, Nikki Haley got 50,000 votes here. And this is, again, she had suspended her campaign. She'd already dropped out and essentially endorsed Trump. 50,000 Republicans still showed up and voted for her. So that's a pretty significant thing. Wayne County, Detroit, 27K there, 21K in Macomb, which is actually a more GOP-leaning county nowadays. And so again, Michigan statewide, Biden won this state by 150K in 2020. It wasn't too close, but it was still within 3%. Nikki Haley got 300,000 votes here almost. So that was very impressive by her, considering she'd already been out of the race. And then kind of going to Pennsylvania, just as our last state here, Nikki Haley did all right here. What was interesting was that she actually cracked 20%, even after being out of the campaign for like over a month at that point. And she did it in a lot of important counties: Delaware, Montgomery, and Chester, all Philly suburbs. She got a combined 30,000 votes there, which is fascinating because, again, Donald Trump in 2020 and 2016 held up well there in the primary. And then Lancaster, which is a more GOP exurban county, maybe an hour and a half away from Philadelphia, maybe 2 hours away from Philadelphia in terms of a drive, right? Haley got 10,000 votes there. And then in Allegheny and Erie counties, these are more working class counties, especially Erie, which is kind of a bellwether. Haley's, vote margin there was twice the margin Biden won the county by in 2020. So even in working class, it was mostly in the suburbs, but even in, some working class areas in states like Pennsylvania, Haley showed signs of strength. So, this is a problem for the GOP, and especially for Trump, because we don't know who these voters are going to break in November. I've seen kind of a wide range of things. I've heard, I heard one estimate that had Harris winning 90% of Haley voters. I don't believe that. I'd be shocked if Harris won 90% of Haley voters. But I've also seen estimates that, still show Harris ahead with the plurality of these voters. And I think that these, this isn't like a monolithic group. I think some of these voters are going to vote for Trump and they voted for Haley maybe because they don't like Trump. They're still going to vote for him no matter what. But I think some of these voters are on the other end. I think some Haley voters are potentially, disaffected Republicans who might want to vote GOP down ballot but cannot vote, stomach voting for Trump. Maybe they even voted for Biden back in 2020, but are still registered as Republicans. They don't like the direction their party's headed. You have a lot of people like that in the suburbs. So, what it really comes down to is how did these Haley voters vote in 2020, and how are they going to vote in 2024? But if the primaries are any indication, if we look at what happened in 2016 and 2020 on the Democratic side, and we apply it to what could happen this year, Donald Trump has a real problem in the suburbs. And I think this is especially prevalent in two states. The first one is Arizona, where he lost by 10,000 in 2020, and Nikki Haley got nearly 111,000 votes in 2024. And then the second state that I think Haley has a real problem potential, or that I think Trump has a real problem in potentially, is Michigan. Now, I think an honorable mention could be North Carolina, because again, Nikki Haley did get like 250,000 votes here, but this was when she was still in the race. Whereas in Michigan and Arizona, she'd been, not campaigning for like a month, and she still got all these votes. So that's why these two states are, I think, the most concerning for Trump. Now, just to kind of go to the electoral map here, just to kind of play around briefly before we end the video, if we give Kamala Harris Arizona and Michigan, she still doesn't win the election. But again, at that point, she'd be very close, because if she won Pennsylvania, she would win the election. So again, at that point, she'd only need she'd only need one state if it's Pennsylvania, but she'd maybe need two of, say, Georgia and North Carolina, or even if it's Georgia and Wisconsin, that would get her to victory. So once you win, if you're Harris, once you win Arizona and Michigan, you need one of these states as Pennsylvania, or you need, a combined two. The only two she wouldn't be able to do would be Nevada and Wisconsin. That would get her very close, but it wouldn't be enough, because Nevada is relatively small. But if it's Wisconsin and North Carolina, or Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, or whatever combination you want to make, that's the election. And so if we do this map, from most concerning to least concerning for Trump in terms of the Haley primary voters, he's in trouble in Arizona and Michigan. North Carolina could also be a concern for him. And then you're kind of down to, I think he'd win Nevada, because his margin there was pretty good actually for Haley. Then you get down to Georgia, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. In Georgia, Haley's vote was 7 times the 2020 margin. In Wisconsin, Haley's vote was nearly 3 times the 2020 margin. Pennsylvania, it was just under 2 times the 2020 margin. So the biggest state would obviously be Georgia. I think you can make the case for Pennsylvania being the biggest concern, just because the sheer magnitude of Haley voters. But again, it's a big state. And whereas in Georgia, 25,000 votes could easily sway Georgia, Pennsylvania, there's a chance that we see a winner there by more than 25,000. So the raw votes, I think, are just a little better for Haley/Harris in Georgia, and that's why I think that could be the fourth most concerning state. But again, any of these states, I think except for Nevada, could be viewed as a pretty significant loss for Donald Trump in the primary. Haley was out of the race. She was, hadn't been running a campaign by the time that 5 of these 7 states voted, and yet we still had hundreds of thousands of Republican voters, registered Republicans, turning out and voting against Donald Trump. And again, 2016, Hillary Clinton did the worst with white working class voters. That hurt her in November. 2020, Joe Biden did the worst in the primary with Hispanic voters. That hurt him deeply in November. So say what you want about primaries being useless, but this is a very interesting data point. And I thought, hey, why not talk about it today? So if you enjoyed my analysis, I try to cover unique topics that you're not going to see on other channels or on other sources of media. So please do subscribe. It really helps me out. It's free. It just helps the channel get boosted and helps me. I'm one person who runs the channel. It helps me out tremendously. Comment down suggestions below. Like the video. Tell me what you think in general. And hopefully I'll see you all tomorrow.